Small gestures have a way of stretching beyond the moment, pulling at threads you can't yet see until a whole new pattern comes into view. If this kind of true-to-life story moves you, stay until the end and consider subscribing and liking to support more stories like this. The city had gone thin with cold. That night, the wind slid down alleys and gathered itself under bus stop canopies, turning breath into brief white ghosts that vanished against the streetlights. Henry Miles stood beneath one of those lights, shoulders curved against a jacket whose collar had frayed and lost its shape. He held a manila folder against his chest like a shield. Under it, a single grocery bag rustled. His truck was parked 2 blocks away, engine warm enough for now, but the heat would not keep him from feeling the chill inside his ribs. The kind that had crept there the winter his wife stopped coming home from hospital visits and did not come back. He watched the world like someone who had learned to watch without assuming it would answer. People moved past with purpose. A woman in a long wool coat tapping a message into her phone. A jogger with red earbuds letting steam rise from his collar. A couple sharing a laugh that made Henry's throat ache with a thing older than loneliness. The bus hissed and settled. Commuters spilled out and formed a neat line. Then she came, smaller than the rest, shoulders tight in an oversized cardigan, hands pressed to the sides of her face as if the motion might drive warmth inward. Her hair had a softness that suggested she had hurried from a late meeting, or worse, had no coat at all. Henry noticed the way the woman's shoes were thin at the heel, and the way one of her gloves had a hole at the fingertip. He noticed because noticing had become a kind of prayer, small, practical, almost invisible. He had been a structural engineer once. Notice for him had been the sharpened eye that found weakness before it mattered. Now, expertise kept him in jobs that lasted a day, a week, fixing scaffolding here, tallying beams for a remodel there. He kept his dignity as best he could. He kept a ring in his pocket, a small, plain silver band his wife had been fond of. He touched it sometimes when the cold became a memory he couldn't bear. When the woman reached the bus stop, the wind pushed her cardigan wide enough to show how thin she was beneath. She stood too close to the shelter's glass and hugged herself. A bus rolled away, glowing in taillight squares, and the remaining passengers took up a little more space among themselves. Henry stepped forward without thinking, the way you step to scoot a chair to invite someone in. He took off his coat. It was an old Barber-like thing, patched at the elbow, lined in a way that still held warmth when the world tried to steal it. He draped it over the woman's shoulders with a careful motion, as if wrapping a blanket around a sleeping child. She stiffened, startled, eyes wide. For a moment, neither spoke. Her face was the face of someone who had not expected to be seen. "Sir?" she said, voice small. "You'll catch cold," Henry said. His voice was not loud. It had the steady grain of someone who had learned to keep measure with grief. He smiled, the way you do to make a stranger feel less exposed. "I'll be fine." She brought the coat closer, pressing it to her chest like an animal. Her words dissolved. She lifted one hand and, after a clumsy pause, reached into a narrow inner pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "There's something in here," she said, as if it were his fault she had discovered it. Color rose in her cheeks as she unfolded the paper. It was a child's drawing, an uneven sun, a crooked house, stick figures with big, careful smiles. At the bottom, in a child's wobbling cursive, 2 names, Noah and Henry. Henry felt the air shift. He had not realized he had been watched that closely, until now. The coat had been his, but the drawing was his son's, a small, secret artifact he carried for days when he could not call. He had tucked the picture into that pocket months before, the paper folded and creased so it sat like a thinned talisman against his ribs. The woman looked up, her mouth forming the shape of that same name. "Noah?" she read, and there was something like recognition in the way she said it, an astonishment that was not just about a name, but about the sudden architecture of connection. "He's my boy," Henry said, catching himself. The confession arrived like a small, necessary surrender. "Been seeing him when I can. He's with other arrangements until my head's clear."
Her expression softened the way quick rain softens hard pavement. She touched the folded drawing as if it might crumble. "He drew this?" she asked. "Is he—" She hesitated, then added, "Your son?" "Yeah," Henry said. "Noah." He did not volunteer the rest. How Noah had been placed in foster care for a season, how a stack of paperwork had grown taller than their apartment and pushed them apart. He kept the shape of his grief to himself. He did not want a stranger's pity. Yet he had given his coat away, and giving had a way of opening things he had planned to keep closed. She patted the coat, fingers going over seams and the stain at the cuff. "Thank you," she said finally, and the word was held open by an understanding neither had to explain. She tucked the drawing back into the pocket and, with a quick, awkward smile, reached out. "I'm Claire," she said, "Claire Langston." "Henry," he answered. The exchange felt like a hinge swinging on a rusted,
simple, ordinary, but enough to move a life. Claire pressed the coat tighter around her shoulders. Her breath puffed in little ghosts, and she watched Henry with an intensity he had not expected. It wasn't curiosity exactly. It was a precise kind of attention people pay when something within them loosens. She handed him a card, a glossy, minimalist rectangle embossed with a name and title. Henry took it, thumbed the edge. On the back she wrote a phone number and something quick and private. "Call me if you ever need help." "That's generous," Henry said. "I'm not generous often," she told him, and the flicker of humor in her eyes was like a match struck briefly. Then the bus arrived, coughing a wet cloud into the street. They said farewell, brief in the way two people concede that their conversation has reached a seam. Henry watched her board, the coat a darker shape against her frame. She turned once on the stairs and waved. He waved back. When she was gone, Henry stood a moment longer. The city drew a breath and went on. He tucked the card into his folder and, with the practiced motions of someone saving heat for later, returned to his truck. The manila folder would be opened again for business tomorrow. Tonight, he would hold the memory of warm fabric and a woman's hand in it like a cigarette lighter he could use later against the cold. Claire rode the bus without meaning to ride it. She sat holding the coat close and the tiny drawing like contraband. Her life was clean-edged by design. Glass towers with angling light, boardrooms where silence was the most dangerous solvent, an apartment with neutral artwork and no children's toys in a corner. She had built around herself a landscape that kept feeling at bay. Memories of her own childhood bouncing between foster homes, a series of placements that had taught her to hold herself like a hard-earned secret. The coat's roughness under her hands felt illicit and necessary. She unfolded the drawing again, tracing the pencil sun with a fingertip, focusing on the way a child's hand turned lines into hope. On the way home, she went over the business day in her mind, the lines of profit and spreadsheets, the meetings she had steered with an ironed patience that came from a life that had little room for error. She had become very good at steering. She was CEO of a company that prided itself on scale and certainty, Infinity Group, a name chosen to suggest reach. The company was known for its edge and its clean messaging about impact. Claire had learned to speak about impact as if it could be parsed into quarterly results. Yet the drawing kept pressing up against her chest. That little scrawl, Noah, Henry, became a knot she could not untie. At the office the next morning, the city looked flatter, the glass facades reflecting light in a thin, indifferent band. She sat at her desk with the coat folded over a chair and the drawing tucked into her planner like a seed. She could have told herself to forget it. Instead, she called Rachel. Rachel answered on the third ring, as she always did. She had been Claire's assistant since Claire had insisted that attention to detail needed a guardian. Rachel's voice carried the pragmatic warmth of someone who had learned to make generosity efficient. Claire spoke with a crispness that surprised even her. "Rachel," she said, "I need you to find a man named Henry Miles." There were a dozen ways Rachel could respond. She did not ask if Claire had lost her mind. She did not laugh. "Do you have more to go on?" Claire slid the card from the jacket into view and held it up. She traced the phone number. "He gave me his coat last night," she said. "There's a child's drawing in the pocket. I want to know who he is. And The word came with a softness she rarely allowed, if he needs something. Rachel took the details with the same economy she used to order lunch for meetings. Quick, thorough. I can pull the shuttle footage, cross-reference service reports, check shelter logs. We have legal and community liaisons who can help with a name search. Claire nodded, though Rachel couldn't see her. The corporate world had taught her an equation. If you could mobilize resources, you could reduce uncertainty. People were often resources. People also carried stories. She had been taught to parse both with a kind of clinical care. By noon, Rachel had assembled a small team: legal brief, driver with clearance for minor surveillance tasks, and a list of community partners whose names read like bookmarks to parts of the city most of the company avoided seeing up close. They found Henry's truck in a municipal lot 2 days later through a combination of bus route match and surveillance footage from a construction site camera. The footage showed him at the bus stop, the exchange preserved like a private film. Rachel watched the clip and sent it to Claire with the text, "Found." Claire watched the footage in her office with the city's hum pressing at the windows. She had been trained to separate data from person, to extract metrics without interrupting the human heart implicit in them. But the footage made something stubbornly human appear. A man, competent in his small gestures, carrying the weight of private sorrow with a dignity that made Claire's chest pin. In the corner of the clip, a child had left his mark in a drawing, and that mark, Noah, arranged itself into Claire's conscience like a call she could not ignore. She asked Rachel to reach out with an offer: a small stipend, a referral to a community center, an invitation to meet. No strings, she wrote in the email. But there were always strings. Rachel drafted the message with an eye for gentleness.
"We saw you. We're here." Claire edited the message once and then again, smoothing edges until the words could not betray the trembling that had lodged in her chest since the night at the bus stop. When Henry got the call, he thought for a long time before answering. The number was private, the voice professional and careful. At first, he suspected a scam, a fake promise meant to lift hope only to drop it back down. He could count on the fingers of a life the number of times someone had promised him the moon and delivered a single sandwich. But the call carried an offer that surprised him. Could he come to the Infinity Group offices for a meeting? It was not employment yet. It was an invitation to talk. He went because curiosity is a dangerous, honest thing. He wore his only clean shirt and packed the manila folder that held blueprints from a small project he'd once been proud of. In the truck, he checked Noah's drawing twice, smoothing the creases with fingers that trembled for reasons he would not let himself say aloud. Claire met him in a conference room that had the sterile calm of a place built to avoid feelings. For once, the glass and leather softened. Henry placed the folded drawing on the table between them. Claire watched it and did not speak at once. She noticed the way his hands were calloused, the way his eyes held back a tide. Her chair made a small noise in the sweeping room. When she finally asked about Noah, Henry told the part he could. A boy loved, a system that had become a detour, father and son separated until chance and patience might make a path. "I don't want to intrude," Claire said after a while, the corporate cadence leaving an odd echo. "I don't know what help looks like." Henry looked at her with an honesty he had not practiced in business. "Most people who offer help want a tidy narrative," he said. "They don't like messy problems. They want the before and after in an afternoon." Claire found herself smiling at a tiny, rueful place inside him. "We don't either," she admitted. "Our storytelling is often neat." She paused. "But we have resources. People work here who want to make an impact that actually lasts, if we can find a way to do it without making more noise than good." Henry folded his hands into his lap. He could feel the small ring in his pocket, cool as a coin pressed to skin. That ring had sat through hospital waiting rooms and nights alone, and small fraternal celebrations when he could afford them. It was a covenant to a past, not a stumbling block to a future. He did not put on airs. "I don't need handouts," he said. "I need," he reached for a word he hadn't used in months, "a place to stand."
And a way to show up for my boy. Claire listened, and something in her, an architecture not learned at the MBA table, softened. In the days that followed, she moved in ways her corporate life did not record, quietly, decisively, and with a courage that did not seek notice. She asked her executive team for a discretionary fund, small compared to the company's profit margins, but large enough to matter to a person. She spoke to legal about the vain, careful phrases that turned generosity into liabilities, and asked them to translate kindness into contracts without suffocating either party. Rachel coordinated meetings with community partners who could provide counseling, temporary housing options, and mentors. But before any of that, Claire did something not measured on any balance sheet. She asked Henry what he could offer the company. It was a risk, a reversal of the posture of charity. "Tell me where you fit," she said. "Not what we can give you, but where you might want to stand with us." He blinked. The question was an unfamiliar one. Companies rarely started with what a person could bring if they were known only as someone who needed. Henry thought of blueprints and beams, of how things kept standing when load lines were understood. He thought of the community center where he had once volunteered, a place of clumsy repairs and better conversations, where young men learned to weld with hands that would no longer tremble when holding a torch. "I can teach," he said. "I can talk to people about making things that last. I can listen to what gets in the way when good plans meet messy lives." Claire watched him, and in his voice she heard an economy of humility that made the meeting feel less transactional. It wasn't just about PR anymore. The coat and the drawing had opened a door in her she had sealed since her own childhood was parceled out to strangers. She found herself imagining a program that would not only offer a single warmth, but build structure. Workshops in the evening for local tradespeople, internships that led to real paid positions, a fellowship where company employees could teach practical skills and listen. It would be part-time at first, Claire said, the planner in her smoothing out possibilities. "We can spin up a pilot, values workshops, and a trades mentoring program. We'll fund a coordinator, provide materials, and partner with Thomas's community center. If it works, we build on it." Henry listened to the outline and felt a careful hope curling in his chest. Hope, in his experience, needed scaffolding. This had scaffolding. It had names. It had a real person, Claire Langston, who, after a short, strange exchange by a bus stop, had decided to see through a small act that had seemed private. He accepted cautiously. "I don't want to be charity," he said. "I want to be useful." "You will be," Claire promised. "And if you don't like what's on offer, you tell me. We'll change it." The days that followed were a series of small, concrete movements. Henry started teaching 3 evenings a week in a back room of Thomas's center, basic structural literacy, the kind of practical math that helped hold up a wall, the small rituals of showing up on time and measuring twice. He arrived with a thermos and the same steady patience. The room smelled of sawdust and heated metal. The interns were wary at first, young men and women who had repeated disappointment like a soundtrack. But Henry's lessons were not grand speeches. They were short, anchored tasks with measurable steps. He taught them how to read a bracing plan and how to be reliable to the point that reliability, threadbare as it sometimes was, started to feel like a muscle tested and gained. At Infinity Group, the change Henry introduced did not happen with trumpets. People who came to the night classes began carrying the memory of the room back into workdays. A mid-level manager stopped by on a Tuesday and remarked how Henry's simple phrase, "measure your load," had settled into a way of talking about deadlines. An intern who had once considered quitting because of overwhelming debt found work through a connection Henry helped broker with a contracting firm. Small wins accumulated like loose coins. The company that had once boasted of impact in press releases began to understand that impact shows its face in incremental progress and in the dignity of being trusted with real responsibility. Claire watched those shifts with an increasing sense of astonishment. She had hoped to do good for the optics of it. She had not expected to feel the quiet thrill of watching people actually change. There were skeptics, board members who worried about brand risk, and managers who tracked outcomes in spreadsheets and worried that such things would not produce immediate returns. But every time a new hire came back to thank Henry for a referral, or a foreman sent a note about a safer site because a craftsperson had learned a safer technique, the cautious voices lost some of their edge. There were harder nights. Henry balanced menial day jobs with teaching and paperwork and the time he was allowed with Noah.
He kept the ring in his pocket and sometimes cried into his pillow, because grief did not file itself neatly into before and after. There was fear, too, about whether a system could accept a man like him as more than a feel-good case study. Claire carried her own difficulties. A childhood without a home had taught her to shield herself, and letting herself be moved by a drawing felt like an exposure she had designed herself to avoid. She worried that her compassion might be an indulgence, a leak in an otherwise watertight resolve. Noah's return required paperwork, patience, and, unexpectedly, legal maneuvering. The company supplied a down payment and engaged a lawyer who arranged a path for Henry to secure a modest house in a neighborhood close to Thomas's center. The deed did not
arrive in a ceremonial envelope the next morning. It came after a slow, bureaucratic process: background checks, meetings with a housing advisor, a co-signing of documents, and a thoughtful trustee who explained the terms in plain language. The company did not buy the house outright and hand him deeds in a private moment. Instead, they provided resources that made it possible for Henry to qualify and to sign papers with his name that would stand in time. When Noah first saw the house, his mouth formed a circle and then a grin. He was older now, 13, with a surprising patience and a small, stubborn laugh. Their reunion was quiet, a shove that was more like a test, a hug that held all the time they had lost, the letting of breath that makes two people who have been surviving separate lives believe again in a single future. Henry walked the rooms slowly with his son, fingers trailing over the banister like a cartographer laying claim to an old, new map. Claire came to meet Noah once, sitting on the back porch as they ate pizza that had lost its virtuous pretension and become simply good. The boy was shy at first, but warmed as he saw Henry's patience mirrored in Claire's careful questions. There were no speeches, no promises, beyond the small, realistic ones they could keep. Extra hours at school, someone to check in on a Wednesday, enough groceries. Even so, the feeling that had been gathering, warmth, the sense of things being stitched rather than patched, settled into something that looked like a beginning. As Henry's role at Infinity grew, so did the changes he catalyzed. He organized a workshop where contractors and company staff learned to listen to the needs of a neighborhood rather than impose plans upon it. He sat at the back of an auditorium and told simple stories of small repair jobs where listening made the difference between a long-term job and a one-off favor. Employees who had once attended corporate volunteer days and left with the satisfaction of a check returned for the workshops and stayed. A foreman who had once muttered that it was easier to quit than to change confessed that he had been at the brink until a small act, the offer of a steady apprenticeship, had pulled him back. He said, in a voice flattened by relief, that he had almost left everything. Henry's presence had not just taught techniques, it had given people a place in which their competence could be trusted. With each small success, the company slowly rewired its self-image. The framed coat, at first a quiet idea Claire had suggested putting up in the lobby as a reminder of the night that began it all, came to represent a symbol everyone could look at without being asked to perform a feeling. It hung in the lobby on a plain wall, a simple plaque beneath it that read, "A small act, a big change." People paused there, some with bemused smiles, some with the private knowledge that they had once been the recipient or the giver of a small kindness that had shifted a life. But the most public moment of recognition, the company ceremony, was something no policy manual could have predicted. It began as a modest gathering, an internal presentation about the pilot program's metrics and stories. It swelled as interns and community members turned up in numbers that outstripped the room's capacity. And at the last minute, it became an event the company could not keep small. A projector threw the boy's drawing larger than life on a screen. A slide of Henry's early lessons appeared beside a timeline of a program that had started, improbably, with a handed coat. Henry stood in the front of the room, his hands folded the way they had been when he first sat across from Claire. He was not a man given to grandstanding. He had never wanted to be the subject of speeches. When Claire called him forward, the applause surprised him, not because he did not deserve it, but because applause for a person like him felt unintentionally theatrical. He felt the small ring in his pocket, the way you feel a child's hand in the dark, a constant pressure, a small anchor.
Claire spoke with a steadiness that was not the same as in boardrooms. This steadiness had warmth threaded through it, an honesty about the awkwardness of the way the company had arrived here. "This began with a coat," she said simply, and the room smiled at the apparent simplicity of that truth. "And with a drawing. We wanted to show that systems can change if people within them decide to act differently." They unveiled the coat in a glass case, lining it with gentle light. Beside it was not only the coat, but a small tin box, polished, ordinary, containing Noah's drawing folded carefully, and a photograph of a younger Henry and his wife on a bench, both smiling in a way grief later made rare. The photograph belonged to Henry. For a moment he felt the private life of his house laid out in public, and he did not shrink from it. He had spent years pretending the past didn't matter much. Now he saw that it had become the bedrock from which he and his son could rebuild. When the CEO thanked Henry, the room offered another applause, deeper this time. A legal advisor presented a package. The company had committed to a formal housing fund and a low-interest lending program for program graduates, and an initial gift toward Henry's mortgage closing costs was announced. The gesture had real paperwork behind it, lawyers who had their terms and conditions spread across a table, and signatures that would not be forged in a moment of sentiment. The deed would be handled with prudence and care. No one suggested anything less. Henry listened as the details were spoken and realized how strange it felt to be both the subject of charity and an instrument of change. He had given his coat to a woman he did not know on a cold night, and the city of his modest life was being rearranged. After the formalities, as people drifted toward drinks and small talk, Claire found Henry standing by the glass case. He watched the coat as if it were a relic, and she understood what he saw. A moment that had been private made visible, the fabric a testament to how ordinary human acts could generate ripples. "You did this," he said, looking at her more than the coat. "Not alone," she answered. "You did it too." They stood in the soft light. Outside, the city kept moving with indifferent efficiency. Inside, the space between them contracted by a few inches, measured and real. Henry reached into his pocket and felt the small silver ring, a reflex that had nothing to do with speech. He thought then, with a kind of fragile courage, of asking Claire to meet him for a walk, to hear more about Noah, to sit at a table without a PowerPoint between them. When he did, she said yes. The proposal did not happen in a moment of corporate fanfare. It did not need to. It was an evening months later, after a community benefit where Henry had led a small group of young tradespeople, and Claire had stayed late to talk to parents. They walked the block where Henry had once given the coat. There was frost on the hood of a parked car, and the air had the clear quality of night that makes breathing feel deliberate. He stopped beneath the same streetlight with the same odd halo. He had practiced the words and found they did not fit on the tongues of rehearsed speeches. He reached for the ring in his pocket, and his fingers closed around cold metal. Claire watched him with a face that had grown softer over months of shared dinners, of visits to Noah's games, of quiet Tuesdays where they would meet in the center's back room to talk about what people needed. "Claire," he said simply, and in that small, steady syllable was everything he had learned about showing up. "I don't have grand things to offer. I have this." He took the ring from his pocket, held it for her to see, modest and plain. "And I have a life I'm trying to rebuild. I have Noah. Would you—" He swallowed. The word lodged with the weight of true asking. "Walk with me?" Claire's hand went to her mouth, a small, involuntary gesture. She had worn control like armor for most of her adult life. Here, under a streetlight, she let that armor be taken down one careful piece at a time. She answered by taking his hand, and then his ring, slipping it onto her finger with a laugh that contained the shock of relief. "Yes," she said, and the single syllable landed between them like an anchor. The wedding was not a boardroom affair. It was held in Thomas's community center, with mismatched chairs and a table of pizza and a cake someone had baked in the early hours of the morning. Noah stood at Henry's side, taller and steadier, and Rachel arranged flowers with a charity-bought ribbon threaded through them. The coat was displayed at the front of the room in its glass case, and people who had once been strangers took turns telling the quick version of how that night had started.
There was a quietness to the celebration that made room for grief as well as joy. They did not pretend that loss had not shaped them. They stood alongside it. When they kissed, it was in front of the coat, their silhouettes a small warmth against a larger story. The city outside kept humming, but inside, laughter and applause wrapped around them like a blanket. Months later, the coat remained in its case in the lobby of Infinity Group. It had become, to all the employees and visitors, a quiet monument to an idea that had once felt naive, the notion that small acts matter. The house where Henry and Noah lived had become a place of steady routines. Noah's laughter, once rare in Henry's life, filled rooms with a sound that made both men look up, as if surprised at their own happiness. Claire's office remained glass and marble, but sometimes she would hang a child's drawing on the wall, where the art had once been neutral and impersonal. She had come to understand some of the things her foster care past had taught her, that she could create structures that protected and also be brave enough to allow mess. She learned to balance spreadsheets and listen to rusted hearts. The two actions did not cancel one another out. They used the company's resources responsibly. The housing fund became a program with clear guidelines. Interns who had been skeptical at first wrote notes months later about how a small shift in employment policy altered the course of their lives. Foremen who had reached the brink stayed. The company did not become perfect. It became more human. That was the point. On the first anniversary of the night the coat had been given, the Infinity Group organized a small exhibit. Photographs of the early workshops, handwritten notes from interns, the tin box with Noah's drawing. They created a short film that played in the lobby, a montage of small acts, a woman passing a coat to a stranger, a foreman showing a young apprentice how to read a bolt, Henry laughing with a boy who used to be lost to him. People watched with the reverence of those who have discovered that the best miracles are human-made. Henry stood beside the display and felt a gratitude that was both private and communal. In his pocket, the ring was gone. He had given it to Claire months before, an offering that paid tribute to the past while making a space for the future. In its place, he carried new things: a keychain with a house key, a worn measuring tape Henry had been given by one of his early students, and the small tin box still tucked in a drawer at home. Noah's drawing was not on the wall now. It had been scanned and enlarged for the exhibit, the pencil lines becoming part of an image that told a subtle truth. People could be repaired by the consistent kindness of others. When Claire found Henry in the evening after the exhibit, they walked down to the river where the city's lights shook on the water like scattered coins. She slipped her hand into his without fanfare. "You were right," she said quietly, echoing a line he had spoken months earlier, but with a different meaning now. "Small things do rewrite lives." He smiled at her, a steady thing that was not B-grade romance, but something more durable. "We rewrote each other's," he said, and the words fit like new timbers in an old frame. They stood there a long time, watching the city's reflection move in the river. The coat remained preserved, no longer merely a piece of fabric, but a witness. People came to see it sometimes, and when they did, Henry would tell them with a casual, careful cadence that the real work had been done in the little, almost invisible things: showing up, listening, teaching, trusting. He would tell them about Noah and how paper suns could hold the bright, tentative shape of a future. And sometimes, when night wrapped the city in its cold, Henry would put on a different jacket and drive a few blocks to Thomas's Center. He would be there to teach a class, to chew over a problem with a foreman who had learned not to quit, to eat pizza at a table with people who had been given second chances they had to earn. He had been handed a coat on a night when the world seemed indifferent, and in that small exchange he had found a corridor that opened into many rooms. Claire kept the card he had left in her hands on that bus stop, no longer a business card, but a talisman she occasionally set on her desk to remind herself how an unexpected meeting could alter the course of a life. Sometimes, in meetings where the boardrooms tried to tilt toward profit over people, she would slide Noah's drawing across the table and say simply, "Measure the load." The phrase had become shorthand for asking whether a decision lifted people or crushed them. The story traveled quietly at first,
Then, because people like stories that suggest hope, it traveled further. A short film played on a loop in the company's lobby. A local paper did a piece that made a few people in the city smile. But the thing that mattered was not the publicity. It was the fact that in small ways, day after day,
The world of a man and his son had shifted toward stability. The coat was a reminder, but it was not the only instrument of change. On a cool morning, Henry opened his front door and found Noah waiting with a drawing in his hands. The boy had drawn a house with a wide, flattened roof, and a father and a son standing under a big, crooked sun. At the bottom, Noah had written, in letters that were still jagged with practice, "Home." Henry folded the paper into his pocket and felt the warmth spread through him in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. He had given a coat to a woman who was, in another life, used to giving orders and balancing margins. That night had become a hinge. Little did he know, when the coat slid around another's shoulders at a bus stop, that a whole neighborhood, a company, and a father-son future would be built from that simple, courteous gesture. He did not see the future then. He only felt the immediate act of making someone less cold. That was the point. Acts small in themselves could, if sustained and cared for, rewrite the lives of many. If that image stayed with those who heard it, the coat in the lobby like an ordinary saint, the tin box with a child's drawing, a deed signed with care, a ring slipped on a finger, then perhaps they might, in their own messy lives, offer a coat, an hour, a listening ear. Perhaps they would see that kindness, practical and stubborn, can be a form of repair. If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us how ordinary choices reshape the world. Visit our channel for other stories of people who chose to act and changed lives in the process. Weeks passed and the change made itself visible in ways that were not loud. Paint went on walls that had been scuffed for years. A sagging sofa was replaced with a round table that fit more bodies. A lunch rota appeared on the back of the kitchen door, and people signed their names with a sort of pride. Henry taught a night class in basic carpentry and budgeting, and, when a student managed to level a shelf true, the applause was small and holy. Then a letter arrived, an envelope with the city seal and an official tone, and Thomas read it aloud in the back room, where the light from the high window slanted dust into a gold line. The letter spoke of plans, a developer's interest in the block, a meeting with councilors, a redevelopment scheme that used phrases like mixed-use opportunity and optimizing asset yield. It closed with a clause about tenants and users being reconsidered in the process. Thomas cursed softly and folded the paper. The word that most people heard as they stood around the table was eviction. The word they did not yet feel was what came next. How easy it is to be moved like a pawn when plans are written in spreadsheets and not in human names. A rumor went out to the neighborhood within a day. People came to the center not merely for soup or shelter, but to ask questions. An old woman who had slept on Henry's couch for a winter listened while he read the letter again and said, "If they take this, they take more than a roof." A young couple who mattered to no official report sat on a crate and mashed their fingers into a cheap coffee cup. Noah pressed his forehead to the window and watched children on the corner make a chain of chalk houses that blew away in a gust. Claire saw the notice on her desk by mid-morning. It was a district plan from the developer that included the center's address. The file name alone made her chest tighten. Her role in the company had always been to weigh risk and growth, but the line between growth and erasure was thinner than she had thought when she read it through the eyes of Thomas's center. She remembered Noah's son, the card Henry had slipped into her hand at the bus stop, and the way the coat had felt heavy with more than fabric. She thought of the phrase she had pushed across a boardroom table like a small, stubborn coin: measure the load. The board meeting was scheduled for the end of the week. Claire prepared not a presentation of numbers, but a packet of photographs and testimonials. She spoke with Thomas and Henry and asked for their stories, then arranged, with a kind of awkward, earnest tact, for a few people from the center to come and sit in the gallery space where the executives usually listened to forecasts.
Let them be people, she told a colleague who asked why she bothered when the deal would increase share value. Let them show what's there already. At the meeting, the room smelled faintly of coffee and the citrus cleaner that the company used to keep surfaces bright for investors. A slide deck unfurled. Charts, projections, the slide with the architect's glossy rendering of glass and stone. Then Claire turned the lights down and handed the floor to Thomas, who carried no designer brief, only a quiet voice. He spoke of nights of rain that made the roof leak, and of men who had once had steady hands but now had to learn how to hold them still enough to sew a seam. He told the story of a boy who had drawn a sun and written home at the bottom in jagged letters. Henry sat beside him and watched, and when Thomas finished, there was a hush no spreadsheet could measure. One executive laughed, an attempt to puncture the awkwardness, and asked how charity fit into a fiduciary duty. Another suggested the company could provide a one-time donation and be done. Claire felt the old map of her life pull, ambition on one side, the memory of the card and the coat on the other. She did not speak for a long breath. The silence was like a second person's presence. Then she reached into her folder and slid a folded drawing across the table. Noah's crooked son. She did not explain why she carried it. She simply set it down. "Measure the load," she said. And the room, used to hearing quarterly guidance, heard instead a kind of question. What does this decision weigh on the lives of the people who live in that block? What does it mean to move children and mothers and men who are trying to rebuild themselves? We can make profit, and we can make places that last. We can do both, but not if we default to the easiest metric. There were voices raised after that, and then a vote was called. It was not dramatic in the way city headlines promise, no shouted scenes of betrayal, but it was a slow, decisive unpeeling of opinion. Some directors worried about precedent. Others, watching the photographs of a patchwork of faces, felt something they had not expected. The motion to pause negotiations and open a dialogue with the neighborhood passed by a narrow but firm majority. It was enough. It was not victory, it was an interval of breath. The developer, confronted with the company's offer to explore inclusive options, affordable units, a relocated community space, a 10-year covenant, agreed to meet again. The first town meeting that followed was a kind of imperfect miracle. The counselor who had been neutral found his voice when an older resident named Rosa spoke of a child who had learned to count from the center's donation of cereal boxes. A representative of the developer arrived with a binder and an expression that suggested he had thought the room would look different. Children played in the corner with blocks, and Noah's drawing was taped to the bulletin board beside the meeting's agenda. People told the facts: lease terms, zoning restrictions, who qualified for relocation assistance. They told the feelings, too, which are facts of another sort. From that day, the center's fate became a project of ordinary persistence. The company pledged funds to retrofit the building so it could remain in place while a new block was developed nearby that included guaranteed affordable units. The developer, pressed by public opinion and the logic of negotiation, altered their plans. The council passed a temporary protection measure while a task force made of residents, company staff, developers, and council aides wrestled with specifics. Meetings accumulated like stitches. Decisions were made that tried to honor both the ledger and the people behind it. In the center, a map went on the wall showing in childlike handwriting, "Our plan." They crossed off dates and circled appointments. Volunteers arrived offering different kinds of expertise. An ex-contractor who could read a blueprint, a young lawyer who wrote clear, patient letters. Claire volunteered to sit on the task force despite the way it would look to peers. There were frustrations, delays, bureaucratic forms, the kind of small humiliations that come with any attempt to move the ground. Still, the rhythm continued. Soup at noon, carpentry on Tuesday, budgeting on Thursday. People kept showing up. Noah grew in a way that could not be measured by numbers. He began to sit with a pile of paper and draw, then teach other children to copy the crooked sun, until, one afternoon, the sun in the hallway looked like a small colony of suns, each with its own imperfection.
Henry got a call from a small contractor who had seen one of his students' finished shelf and wanted to hire him for weekend work. He left class that night with sawdust in his hair and a new sort of tiredness, one that meant his work was being used. At the opening of a newly renovated wing, bright but still human-sized, Claire stood with Thomas and Henry, and the coat hung in a glass case nearby, not as relic, but as witness. A plaque under it read a single sentence chosen by the people who had helped decide, "For small things that grow." People lined up to sign their names on a donor board. Children ran under the rafters. The developer's representative gave a measured speech about compromise and respect. A counselor spoke about duty. A woman who had been homeless in the winter spoke about the warmth that saved her life when she thought she had no options. That night, as lights burned low, Henry and Noah walked home along the river. Noah carried a new drawing, this time a house with a roof that, though not perfect, was proudly straight. "Do you think it will always be okay?" he asked, holding the paper with both hands as if it might crumble. Henry thought of the coat folded in the center's case, of the long chain of small acts that had made a plan bend. He thought of the nights teaching men to steady a hand, of long board meetings, and of the way Claire had set a drawing on a table and changed the temperature of a room. He pulled Noah close for a moment and said, "No, not always, but we make it so sometimes. We keep stepping." Claire, when she went home that night, took the card Henry had once left in her hand and, on a whim, slid it into a book she was reading. Months later, she would look and find it there and laugh at the exactness of memory. She changed the wording on some of the company's internal documents. She pushed for a line that required human impact reviews on any project that affected residential blocks. It was a small clause in policy, but, like Noah's sons, it multiplied when others copied it. Word of what had happened around the center went beyond their block. A local paper ran a piece not about the architecture, but about a community unbent by attentive hands, and the piece made its way to other neighborhoods. A student in a different part of the city photocopied Noah's drawing and taped it to a school corridor. Sometimes the smallest image is the truest map, a child's jagged letters telling where to put your feet. People began to treat the center as a model in the way someone treats a recipe that worked. They asked questions. What do you spend? How do you keep people at the table? The answers were practical and stubborn. Show up, measure the load, pay attention. They were not the kind of answers that changed the world overnight, but they were the kind that coaxed it gradually into coherence. In the years that followed, Henry's hands learned to trust their strength. Noah learned to measure with a ruler and to draw a straighter sun. Claire lost some of the shine that had come with promotions, but gained mornings when she could see a child's laugh across the lobby and know, without calculation, what was worth protecting. Thomas, who sometimes wandered the renovated rooms and sat quietly by the case that held the coat, would say, with a modest pride, that none of it was miraculous, only persistent. Henry would insist otherwise. He liked the idea that miracles were small and persistent. One evening, when the city was a pool of lights and the river was a long black seam, Henry and Noah walked past the lobby glass where the coat hung, its sleeve catching the light. Noah paused and peered in, then turned to his father and said plainly, "This is where people keep memories." Henry smiled at the boy who had taught him the meaning of a paper sun. "Yes," he said, "and sometimes they keep futures." They continued down the street, and the city continued to turn. In quiet places, lives rearranged themselves around the ordinary acts of arrival and care. Dinner shared, a hand offered, a compliance form that now included a question about children. The ripples of the coat and the drawing and a woman's refusal to let a decision be just profit continued to move out, imperfect and sure. And somewhere, in an office where decisions still had to be made, someone slid a small drawing across a table and asked, with a steadying tone, if the plan would measure the load. The question landed and did some work. The answer would be given in many tiny ways afterward, by a carpenter who taught a class, by a developer who altered a plan, by a child who drew a sun and named it home. The world did not become an easy place. It became, little by little, a place where small things were given the chance to matter.